Hi everyone, my name is Casper, and in this video, I wanted to kind of do a reflection on where my monster epistemology came from. I feel like it's a little self-indulgent, and this video isn't going to be like super philosophical or deep. It's just more of kind of like how I formed my thoughts and where they actually came from. Because even though monster epistemology, it just seems like a normal idea, I think it's a very profound idea. It changed so many of my beliefs and what I think about things, and especially because I used to be an objectivist in the past, and then discovering monsters as a philosophy, it has created so much growth, intellectual growth for me, and enlightened me and helped me think about the world in a way that is so much better than before. And so I'm just really grateful for this monster idea and how I came about to it. And I just want to talk about it. So this monster idea came from an English class that I took in in college in my freshman year. And it was a very simple English class. It was a general education class. It was a requirement. It was mandatory. At the time, I was studying computer science, and then I switched my major to accounting. And I recently graduated as an accountant, which is another reason why I have decided to talk about this. Is kind of just reflecting on my experience as a university student and how I how I feel about university. So the main thing about this class again is that it was a writing class. It was just about how to write better as a college freshman. What are the basics? And I have like a bunch of different sections here, um, like works we read in class. We read a lot of philosophical works and a lot of intellectual works, which I thought was kind of weird for a writing class. Like, it's kind of crazy. My professor, he talked about Foucault, he talked about Kant and the Sublime, he talked about Hannah Arendt, and right, he mentioned Hannah Arendt, and I thought it was just like at the time I was an objectivist and I was a big fan of Ayn Rand, and when I was learning computer science, that's also when I was learning about object oriented programming and making the connection to objectivist epistemology. So I was a pretty philosophical person at that time. And it's another reason why even though I'm not an objectivist anymore and I still like Ayn Rand, she's still a great thinker. For She's like the gateway drug to philosophy in a lot of ways. Like, you hear so many stories of people who got into philosophy because of Ayn Rand, who started out as libertarians and then they ended up as more genuine thinkers later on. I'm not saying like libertarianism is bad, but I'm just saying it's just interesting how a lot of people come into philosophy through Ayn Rand, because there's something about academia and university that can be overwhelming or too leftist for a lot of people, or off-putting, or too like, don't be racist and you can't be a white male or something like that. And this kind of and that's what the teacher kind of touched on that topic, right? He talked about PC culture, and I love that this teacher of this English class, he was something else. I mean, there was nothing about him that was particularly like that stood out. I'm not saying that as like a negative thing. It's just like when I took this class, I didn't realize how deep it went and how much like this professor really thought deeply about things in ways that I didn't even realize. Because again, I was an objectivist at the time, and so when this professor mentioned thinkers like Foucault, who it triggered me, and at the time I also really liked Jordan Peterson. So I was like, I thought I was being propagandized to, or I thought I was being pulled into the cult of university. I thought I thought this professor was trying to turn me into some kind of feminist leftist kind of thing. I mean, that's how sensitive I was and how closed my mind was to new ideas because of where I started from philosophically. And so the professor, I mean, he talked about PC culture and he talked about how conservatives might feel left out in universities. At least I think he did. Um, and he also talked about the humanities. And that was one of the very first questions he asked us, or like the second class we went to at the very beginning. It was just about what are the humanities? Because you really do see this major divide between the humanities and the sciences, between the humanities and the arts and engineering, and that there are two kinds of people. There are like creative types, people who really enjoy poetry and art and all of that, and then there are people who want to do math. They want to get a good degree so that they can get a job. And it's kind of sad because when I do tell people that I'm an accountant, I do get like very different responses. Like some people say like, "Oh, did you enjoy it? I mean, is it something you enjoy? Did you follow your passion? Is that what you're passionate about?" And I'm just like, "Well, I mean, it'll pay the bills, it'll make good money." Right? And then there's another group of people who are like, "Oh yeah, accounting is a really good major. You're going to do really well with that." You know, the who would major in art? That's so stupid. Who would major in literature or English? That's those are for stupid people. So you get those two kinds of people, and you really see this opposition, or this idea that the humanities are dumb, the humanities are corrupt by leftists, by postmodernism, and I just want to say that's just not. I mean, maybe it is true, but it's not really true. The humanities are really, really important, and they're important in it's not so much about going to university so that you can be educated and enlightened. It's the humanities are important because they teach you how to be human. And this is how it ties into monsters. Because again, I mean, this professor in this English class, the whole point of this, or not the whole point, but this class is what led to me to study monsters. Because one of the main essays that we wrote in this class was an essay on monsters. The professor was just like, write an essay on monsters. He left it very broad and very open as the topic. It just had to be a monstrous topic in some way. And I thought that was so genius and amazing and insightful because, I mean, if you really think about it, right? Like, why do I love monster epistemology so much? Or monsters? You know, it's because they're showing us evil. It's because monsters are at the limits of reason. They show us what happens when categories break down, or they're the phenomenal. They're the phenomena that we get when categories break, and so they show us the limits of our reason. And our professor, you know, he talked about Kant and the sublime and all of that stuff. And so monsters are just such a fascinating topic because they are at the apex of like some of the most important and most interesting philosophical ideas. Like the most important stuff seems to happen. Like the most important questions related to epistemology and ontology are going to arise when you talk about monsters. I mean, because a few days later, I'm not even sure, a few days later. It's been such a long time since I've taken this class. It's been years. So I've kind of forgot a lot what happened. But, you know, the professor did ask us, like, what is hauntology? He asked us, what is epistemology? Which, again, this is a freshman English class. So it was a lot more philosophical and deeper than I thought it was. It was kind of like, I wasn't overwhelmed by the questions because I was studying Ayn Rand, so I did know what ontology was. I did know what epistemology was, and I actually felt kind of proud of myself that I was the only kid in the class who could actually raise my hand and say, yeah, I know what epistemology is. It's the theory of knowledge. In other words, it's asking the question, how do I know what I know? I felt like a genius, even though really, if you're in a philosophy class, that's actually pretty basic. But anyway, for an English class, it felt strikingly deep for a class that felt really shallow on the surface. And it did for a lot of the time. When I was taking this class, it did seem kind of like a waste of time. Like, I was interested, I was engaged because, again, I was studying objectivism. I already enjoyed philosophy. So even though we went through all of these thinkers that were leftist and postmodernist and whatever, and anti-capitalist, I was still very engaged in the class. But I wasn't that engaged in the class because after I finished this class, I actually didn't make any real connections. Like, I was still an objectivist, I was still an ideologue for like 2 years. For like 2 years, I didn't really think deeply about the text that we went over in class. But for some weird reason, in 2021, I rewrote the essay, which, so for the class, it was only 8 pages long for the actual class, the essay that we had to write on monsters. I titled it Demonstrations. I talked about Godzilla and how monsters are warnings and they put a face on evil so that we can see it. That was basically the main thesis of my essay. And I talked about, did I even talk about Frankenstein in my essay? In the original essay? I don't know. But it wasn't until 2 years later the class really started to sink in because, and I think it's because, and I can't remember because it was a while ago, so like my memory is like lost on this, but I think I was reading a part of Atlas Shrugged, and I was also reading Frankenstein again, and I made this connection between Frankenstein and Atlas Shrugged, like this idea of the modern Prometheus. And at first, it just, like, it's kind of funny because, like, you're an objectivist, but you didn't make the connection between Prometheus and Frankenstein, which you read in class. Like, what are you doing? But I made that connection, and that's what really inspired me to rewrite my essay for the class, which turned into like 21 pages, right? As you can see, it's 21. Well, it's technically 18 pages and then 21 pages with footnotes. But I was just really kind of amazed that this Frankenstein book connected a lot more to objectivism than I thought it did. And you should watch my video on why Rand demonized Kant, because I basically explained that I don't feel like I need to go into in this video. And then the rest of the class, I just started making all of these connections. And then I came to the conclusion that monsters are so important philosophically. And that's how the monster epistemology was born. But it took a while. Again, it took years after I took the class for me to actually form these connections in my head. And these connections, I feel like this professor is honestly, I don't know if he's a genius. I don't know if having us write on monsters was just part of the English curriculum, because if you type in like monster epistemology or monsters and ontology in the internet, a lot of websites show up that are just like university websites. And it looks like it's part of an English curriculum, or it's a very common English curriculum. So maybe the professor was kind of, maybe he didn't really care that much about monsters. Maybe the sources that we read in class, all of these different sources, maybe they didn't have anything to do with what he cared about. But another part of me believes that a lot of these ideas that just seem so, like, again, all of these different sources and texts, they just seem so random. And they seem so, like, why are we reading this? Especially because they all seem so leftist. It just felt to me like leftist propaganda or something, which I think is so funny. Like, that just shows you how much growth I've made as a thinker, and why university is good, why the humanities are so important. Like, I guess to go back just for a second, when you talk about the humanities versus STEM, I already talked about this, but STEM is really good for making money, right? It's really good for manipulating reality, controlling reality, getting what you want from reality. But the humanities maintain our humanity. And I think this is why the professor at the beginning of the English class asked us about the humanities. He brought us back to that question, or it was the first question he asked, because I feel like if you're studying all of these monsters, why are you studying them? You're studying them to be more human. You're trying to figure out like what is really evil and what is not evil. And I think evil, right? Because it's not the monsters that arise from your categorical breaks that are truly monstrous. Dragons aren't really monstrous. Um, People that you disagree with are not monstrous. People you demonize are not monstrous. What's monstrous is your lack of humanity. What's monstrous is your lack of your reading skills. And it doesn't make you a bad person if you're illiterate, but if you can't read, if you can't write, if you can't do basic English writing, if you can't write, then you devolve into monstrosity, in my opinion. You live in a world of monsters, you become a monster, the universe becomes a terrifying place. The universe is incomprehensible. Like, I feel like the humanities in many ways are just being able to get a grasp of monsters and being able to navigate monsters more effectively. And I think maybe this is why it's part of the English curriculum, because and why English professors love this, because it validates their field, and it makes English as a study worthwhile, to write novels and to read books and to learn how to actually communicate and how to argue and how to understand ideas is actually very, very important and essential to our humanity and to navigating life properly. It's not enough to just be an accountant or a computer scientist. It's not enough to just make money. If your goal in life is just to go to university and make money, you're going to run into so many problems that you will face, and you won't even know that they're problems. You're going to fall into a really bad world, and you won't even be able to see that you're in this bad world because you're so mathematical or scientific, or you're so lost in this being an engineer that you've forgotten like the humanity of things. And again, you shouldn't have this attitude of being, a humanities person or an engineering person, or like you only do math and physics and you don't have time for poetry and art. I think that's ridiculous. I think we should all be like math people, physics people, art people, poet people. I think that distinction is a false distinction. I think it's a bad distinction. In the past, philosophy used to be part of science. Psychology used to be part of philosophy. Philosophy underlied all of these fields. So, I mean, there really isn't much of a difference between science and philosophy. And if you do science, your science can lead to really bad or silly conclusions if you don't have a philosophical understanding of the science that you're doing. So the humanities are very, very important. Um, Obviously, I mean, that's why the professor had us think about it. So, yeah, it's just we read so many amazing stuff in class. We talked about different thinkers. Like, so we talked about Hannah Arendt. I had no idea who Hannah Arendt was, But the professor just name dropped her like randomly one day when we were having a class discussion. He talked about Hannah Arendt. He didn't even mention Eichmann, but I can almost guarantee you that Hannah Arendt's book, The Banality of Evil, was the book he wanted us to read and to talk about in our monster essays. Sometimes I almost wonder, like, again, this is what I find so weird is like when the professor was running his class and having us read all of these texts, like, did he choose these texts on purpose? Or was this just part of some curriculum that was just thrown together? You know? Because a part of me wonders if, like, he already knew a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about. Like with my monster epistemology videos, I feel like a lot of the time it's just making connections explicit that were implicit in my English class all of these years ago. Like our professor again, he only mentioned Hannah Arendt, but I feel like in my monster epistemology, I've actually looked at Hannah Arendt's book on the banality of evil and linked it to monsters because I think this professor had the same thought in his own head that monsters, even though they're sublime and there's a lot of awe and wonder and terror, there's something strangely banal about evil. And that's what Hannah Arendt was driving at with her book on Eichmann, that even monsters can be banal, that the average person, which, an administrator, a bureaucrat, a government worker, which is at the center of civilization and law and order, is actually the monstrosity. Because we usually think of monsters on the outside of life, not of life, but outside of our comfort zone, outside of our limits of reason. While government workers are the people who construct society and make society run. But Hannah Arendt, especially given her character and how she's more of a thinker or a journalist rather than a philosopher, Hannah Arendt was, she didn't, like a lot of other philosophers, what makes her different and unique is that she didn't construct this overarching narrative or belief on life. She didn't construct this architectural philosophy. She's very anti-totalitarian. She was very suspicious of that kind of stuff. And I think that's what allowed her to see the monstrosity in people like Eichmann, to see the banality of evil. Because a lot of us tend to see evil on the fringes, not at what's at the center, and everything's normal and banal and dull, and so, which is really interesting. And it also links very well to being an accountant, and why, when you're dealing with abstractions and numbers, it can be actually very dangerous. We take numbers for granted. We take abstractions for granted, but you can do a lot of damage with these numbers. That if you're just a simple administrator, you actually have a lot more responsibility than you realize. That it's important to be critically minded and to think deeply. That there's a lot, you really need the humanities more than anything else if you're an administrator or a bureaucrat. And then we also talked about Neil Postman. He is wonderful. He has this speech on Visigoths, which I absolutely love. Just Google it. It's like a BYU speech, University of BYU. And he makes this distinction between Visigoths and Athenians. And it's just a beautiful kind of summary of someone who is part of the humanities and someone who isn't. And then Godzilla was mentioned a few times, obviously, because he's one of the biggest and coolest monsters ever. And Louis C.K. was mentioned, and the Me Too movement, because back in the day, the Me Too movement was really hot. and Louis C.K. was, he was like, I don't know, he got involved in some kind of sexual scandal. And the professor mentioned him, part of the Me Too movement, but what's really interesting is that I think the professor mentioned him not because of the sexual scandal, but I think he mentioned Louis C.K. because Louis C.K., if you actually look at his comedy skits, all of his different comedy shows, they're actually profoundly connected with monsters. And Louis C.K. in general is just, I think he's one of the best comedians ever. Louis C.K. recently wrote a story. He wrote a fiction novel, which suggests that Louis C.K. is actually much more deep than we give him credit for as a comedian, because usually comedians are clowns. They're not that deep. They're just making fun. But Louis C.K., I mean, a lot of the stuff he talks about are very like existential, philosophical, even though he's just a comedian and it's funny. It's there He touches on monstrosity. He touches on monster epistemology profoundly with his humor. And he's also, again, he's one of my favorite comedians because he's just hilarious. Of all of the comedians I watched, Louis C.K. makes me laugh out loud when I'm by myself, and that tells you something. Like a lot of comedians that I watch, I usually laugh if other people are around me or it's kind of respectful to laugh. You know, you just laugh because it's kind of like, oh, it's a comedy show, I'm supposed to laugh. But like Louis C.K., he makes me laugh on impulse. Like, he genuinely makes me laugh because I think he's actually a really funny guy. So, and what's interesting about this class is Jordan Peterson was never mentioned. And I feel like Jordan Peterson, in many ways, I think this professor wanted Jordan Peterson to be talked about. Even though he never mentioned Jordan Peterson, I can guarantee you he was probably kind of like, you know, throwing conservative students a bone because Jordan Peterson talks about monsters too. So Jordan Peterson could have easily have been talked about in the class, but no one was conservative enough or intellectual enough to mention Jordan Peterson, even though every time you mention Jordan Peterson and like if you mention Jordan Peterson around philosophy students at university, they're just going to laugh at you. I don't know why. I don't know where that arrogance comes from. I mean, I guess I do because leftists think Jordan Peterson is just, I don't know, anyway. So, yeah, we read all kinds of, again, we read Michel Foucault. That was really surprising to me for an introductory to writing class. We're reading Michel Foucault. Like, I mean, again, it triggered me so much as an objectivist because I felt like this is postmodern. This is a postmodernist. Like, what is happening? Um, we read Terror, Philosophy, and the Sublime by Richard Kearney. Absolutely amazing. Extraordinary Beings by Professor Asma. Professor Asma is a great professor on monsters. You should definitely check him out. He has a YouTube channel. He has two YouTube channels. He has a normal YouTube channel where he talks about monsters. He has a book where he wrote on monsters. Classic book on monsters. Definitely read it. But he also has a YouTube channel, Unusual Knowledge or something. It's been a while since I've watched it. I need to actually get back into watching it. I watch his channel from time to time, but it's like the channel is called like Professor Asma on Unusual Knowledge or something like that, which makes a lot of sense because if you study monsters, you come across knowledge that is unusual. Monsters are unusual knowledge. Monsters are the gateway to knowledges and ideas that you don't come across normally. They Say, I Say, Normal, very good textbook, which when we read this textbook, it was a very simple book that was just about like, you read what everyone else says and then you say something. This very simple English class was just about like how to contribute in the conversation, how to contribute philosophically to ideas. And then of course Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, obviously a classic monster book, like, and we read that in class. We watched the Psycho movie, Michael Jackson's Thriller. I mean, these are all like really great sources. But so, and I'm not going to go through all of them just because there's so many. And some of them are honestly, I don't think I'm going to visit them ever again. on authority of the study of writing. That was pretty interesting. Um, I can't remember this exactly, but I do remember one day when the professor was talking about like how an author has an authority over a text and saying that the text was dead in a sense. Like it was a dead text. Like once you write something, it's dead. It's frozen or like a past thing. Um, and we were reading Frankenstein at the time, and this this is how Frankenstein connects so well with artificial intelligence, and why again this class is so profound to me. Like just an introduction to writing class in university. Like people think general education is stupid and that university is like a waste of time, but like think about it. Think about how profound this is. Like Frankenstein and the authority on study of writing, right? If you have all of these authors and all of these dead texts, and then you have artificial intelligence that's scouring the internet, that's scraping the internet for all of these ideas, what is that like when artificial intelligence does that? It's the same thing as Victor Frankenstein going out into the cemetery and the graveyard and constructing this creature with all of these different limbs and body parts and giving it life. That's what artificial intelligence is doing. It's creating Frankenstein monsters like this every single second. And I can guarantee you the professor of this class had this thought in his head. Like, I bet he predicted what artificial intelligence was going to do. He never said it out loud, though. This professor was very, like, it's interesting because after I took this class and 2 years went by, I emailed this professor asking him, telling him, like, oh my God, all of these sources connect in all of these amazing ways and monsters are so interesting. And, it was a really great, like, email, and, he was very happy for me to say that, and, like, you're on fire and all of this stuff. Like, you're such a great student for being able to make these connections, that kind of thing. But like this professor was very like he did not preach to you. He did not tell you what to think. This is why I feel like my monster epistemology is kind of like telling you what to think sometimes. Because again, a lot of it is just making the ideas of this class explicit, like making these connections that the professor wanted us to make ourselves. Like, I think he wanted us to make the connection ourselves that all of these dead texts that are reconstructed with artificial intelligence are like Frankenstein monsters. I think he wanted to make that connection. On the other hand, who knows, maybe when you read all of these texts in a simple humanities class, and why university is so great is that it's so enriching if you just think critically about it. Like, the ideas that we have in front of us at university, the professors, the access to books, and, the sources that we're introduced to, they're so rich and deep that they allow for the greatest insights and connections that maybe the professor didn't even know. Maybe he didn't know he was making this implicit connection. Like, I'm not sure, but it's just pretty I don't know. It's pretty cool. I don't know. It's just exciting. Like, it seems so silly that, like, this is just an English class. What are you getting so excited about? But then it's like these ideas that they're so easy to gloss over and to ignore. Like, even when we talked about Malcolm X and how Malcolm X, when he went to jail, he taught himself how to read and how to write with a dictionary. He would copy the dictionary line by line by line, and he became this great speaker and this great articulator of thought. And it kind of shows you that anyone can train themselves to be a great speaker. Like, anyone can be a philosopher, and it shows you the power of words and the power of communication and why the humanities are so important. Like, yeah, don't get a degree in the humanities. You don't need to become a professor, but like, it shows you the importance of reading and writing. Like being able to read and write, being able to understand ideas is so, I mean, it really is enlightening. Like it's what keeps your humanity and from devolving into monstrosity. Um, at least that's the conclusion that I made. Um, I feel like, yeah, he also emailed me about Marilyn Robinson, who was a Calvinist, and that was pretty interesting because, um, Calvinism. We also read Max Weber, which is, he wrote that book, The Protestant Ethics and the Capitalism, or something like that. And I don't know. It made me think, like, is my professor a Calvinist or not? I wasn't entirely sure if he was. I had a feeling that um he might have been, but then, like, Marilyn Robinson and Calvinism, and I feel like Calvinism in a weird way ties really well with monsters in a lot of ways. And I'll do that. But he also emailed me about Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, Dostoevsky, Ralph Waldo Emerson, which these are philosophers that I already knew, but and obviously, if you study monsters, you're gonna get to a point. It's going to touch on existentialism. So of course, you'd have to talk about these philosophers. I mean, they're so fundamental to philosophy and ideas. But yeah, and it was pretty cool because I even mentioned thinkers that were outside of the class, like much later. Like I mentioned Derrida to this professor, and gargoyles, and it was kind of funny too because he offered to actually write me a letter of recommendation, and it made me think like maybe I should get a master's in philosophy. Maybe I should become a professor of philosophy or something. I mean, I don't know. I feel like that's like, honestly, I feel like I'm so burned out from school. And again, it kind of goes back to what I said already. You don't need to get a degree to do humanities or to do philosophy. You just do philosophy because it's part of being human and, being a well-rounded, like happy person and a humane person. Like you should want to do philosophy and to get clear about your beliefs and how you feel about life, because if you don't, you're just going to get lost. But yeah, and it kind of just, especially after graduating as an accountant, it really did make me think like, you know I could go back to school and study philosophy. And I feel like what would make me actually want to get a master's in philosophy would just to make better arguments, because I feel like, and to learn like scholarship skills, like how to actually find sources and how to actually argue properly and to be logical, like to brush up on logic, because like I don't actually, like I've never actually studied logic. I've never actually studied, how arguments can be verified as correct or incorrect. Um, but I mean, I could study it myself. So I feel like that's the only reason why. And also, like, I think it would be kind of fun to be a lecturer at a university, which a part of me feels like that's not a real productive job. Um, because like it just seems like there is a kind of like infinite loop or a kind of a false industry in the academic world where academics are just teaching students to become academics so that those academics can teach more students, and it's just kind of like this this cycle or this loop. And the other thing about university that kind of makes me not want to go into it is that university seems very, it can be overly detailed and specific and rigid and rule based, that it almost stifles your creativity and your ideas. Like my monster epistemology, I feel like that would be my dissertation in philosophy, but like what if the people above me, what if the professors don't like my monster epistemology? What if they think it's too continental and not, you know, what if they're into analytic philosophy or something? What if, what if monster epistemology is too broad of a topic and it's not specific enough? Like I feel like to become a professor with a PhD, you have to do real scholarly work in a very particular area that is precise. And I just feel like, and if you think about it, a lot of the greatest philosophers ever, like Nietzsche or Schopenhauer, they were mostly outside of academia. They weren't in academia. And if you look at a lot of great, if you look at, I mean, they're not great, but if you look at a lot of professors with PhDs in universities, they're not exactly cranking out books like Nietzsche. They're not exactly changing philosophy. They're writing very, very specific things that are almost kind of like, who really, does that even really matter? Or there's scholars or academics who try to perfectly articulate the ideas of Immanuel Kant or Hegel, right? They become Hegel scholars or Kant scholars, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. I think that's cool, but it just feels like philosophically that doesn't strike me as very interesting. Like, let's move on to the new ideas. What are the next breakthroughs? I think it would be actually more cool to have, I'd much rather try to build a new philosophy and have scholars articulate my work for me rather than becoming a scholar and articulating philosophers of the past, if you know what I mean, right? So anyway, is there anything else I want to reflect on for this class? um yeah, I don't know. I guess I've already talked about this on my channel before, but there really does seem to be like a huge problem between the humanities and philosophy, and then science and engineering and making money. And you know how do you balance between making money and pursuing the humanities? And I guess I would say, if you're going to do anything philosophically, you should not make money from it, unless you're being entertaining. And like it's hard to say, but I'm like, you should always be able to come from a place where you can express ideas and thoughts without depending on making money for those ideas or thoughts. Because if you have to depend on an audience to make money, then I don't think you can really speak the truth. I don't think you can really create new ideas or say anything meaningful or really question the system the way it needs to be questioned. You can't be a real philosopher if you make money as a philosopher, because then I think you really are traditionally just a sophist in ancient Greece. You're like one of those sophists. And so that's why I became an accountant. Even though I think at the end of the day, I'm very much a humanities type of person, and I consider myself a philosopher fundamentally, I became an accountant because the, I will always be able to make money that way, and it will always pay the bills, and I don't need to, I can just do philosophy on the side however I want to, um, without having to worry about corrupting my philosophy, because I already have money over here. So that's why I became an accountant. And also, just on a side note, I think accounting teaches you a respect for the business world and capitalism, which is something that a lot of humanities types of people, like all humanities people who studied the humanities, they tend to all be leftists or Marxists, which is, that's fine. I understand the criticism of capitalism. Capitalism is brutal and inhuman in a lot of ways, even though it is the most human system compared to socialism and totalitarianism and fascism and feudalism. There is something very inhuman about capitalism. I guess all economic systems are inhuman because economics are about money. It's purely about money and the production of goods, and there's a lot more to being human than producing goods and producing things. And not all goods and values are something that can be produced and have a price slapped onto it, right? Like love is a value, art is a value, joy is a value, going out for a walk in the sunshine is a value. These are things that you can't put a price on, right? If you try to put a price on these things, it's just silly. So there's a lot of, so yeah, accounting teaches me a respect for the business world. It also teaches me where the business world has its limits while also having a humanities love of the humanities, because I don't want to become Eichmann and just abuse these abstractions. I don't want to. So yeah, I feel like an accountant is actually it's a great middle ground in a lot of ways, even though it's a very business oriented degree. And yeah, I think, yeah, this professor was so awesome. This class was so awesome. It changed my life. Um, Not sure if there's anything else really to say. I'm just so grateful. I have so much gratitude for this professor. Like, I owe a debt to him because, um, like, if I ever do write my book, on monster epistemology, it will only have become a thing because of this English class, which I just think is so funny. Like, and it shows you the value of general education classes at university. Like, it's not a waste of time. I mean, it kind of is a waste of time for the most part, but just having a professor there and giving you basic sources, because, like, there's no way I would have, I mean, I would have, but, like, to discover, like, I don't know, Terror Philosophy and the Sublime by Richard Kearney, would I have been able to find that article on my own? I mean, I don't know. Would I have read Frankenstein by Mary Shelley ever? Unless I was kind of forced to read it in an English class? I don't know. Like, I feel like universities and professors, as much as they are kind of, in a funny way, are their own industry and are ruled by capitalism in a weird way and need money, I also feel like they're very important for holding, like, general knowledge, for exposing you to real ideas. And, it's kind of interesting too. Like, there's also a third response that I've gotten, to telling people that I graduated as an accountant. So obviously there's the first two where people are like, oh, do you really like accounting? That's going to kill your soul as a human being. So that's the first. The second one is, oh, you're going to make so much money and, the humanities are dumb. And then there's a third one where people say going to university is stupid and it's a waste of time. And, you know, I'm not entirely sure that's true. I feel like universities are important, and um, maybe universities are dying and going away, but I don't know if that's a good thing. I don't know. Um, I mean, if they do go away one day, and they could, I think that is a sign that things are in decay. I think it's a sign of intellectual decay, because there's a lot of people, um, you know, who think that they don't need university, and they think professors are just eggheads and whatever. But these people who attack university very often are people who are so detached from knowledge and ideas and genuine philosophy, and it's just kind of a disaster. Um, so, yeah, kind of a weird note to end on, but that's all I have to say. Thank you for listening to this video. That was my story for how I came to monster epistemology, and I will see you later. Okay, bye.